Good morning, everyone, and thanks for your participation in this seminar. I just want to make a couple of introductory comments before we start on the lines of evidence. I think the first is to note how difficult it is to talk about forced organ harvesting. The idea of killing innocent people for their organs is so horrifying that people don't want to hear about it or don't believe that it could possibly be true. And that's what makes it so important about understanding what evidence there is to prove that forced organ harvesting occurs in China, and to understand this well enough to feel confident talking to others about the evidence. There's a general important point about evidence that I'd like to make that was brought out in the China Tribunal, and that is that the Tribunal relied on two types of evidence, direct and indirect. Direct evidence clearly proves or shows the truth of a matter, like proving a robbery if someone clearly sees a robber take a woman's purse, for example. In our case, most direct evidence comes from people who are personally involved in forced organ harvesting. For example, the China Tribunal Witness 26 described being ordered to participate in forced organ harvesting in the 1990s from a prisoner who was still alive after his execution, and Enver Tohti has similar direct evidence. Published medical accounts of killing victims for their organs is also direct evidence. Direct evidence is the strongest and most compelling type of evidence, but it's hard to gather. It's hard to gather direct evidence about forced organ harvesting in China for two main reasons. The first is that organ harvesting takes place in secret in an operating theatre with limited access. The evidence is destroyed, including cremating the victim's remains and cleaning the theatre. And this makes it hard for people who are not involved to see what's going on. And of those who are involved, none will give evidence voluntarily. The victims are dead, so cannot speak. The other involved people are the medical and theatre staff and prison guards. And they will not speak because if they do so, they will be implicating themselves in committing crimes, the crime of murder and organ trafficking. So anything they say could be used to prosecute them. But more importantly, forced organ harvesting is sanctioned by the Chinese government, which means the government supports it. And anyone speaking out against Chinese policy, written or unwritten, against the government is at risk of being imprisoned or worse and putting their families at risk. So there are these very strong reasons why we don't have a lot of direct evidence. But we do have a lot of indirect evidence, which is the other type of evidence the China Tribunal used. Indirect evidence supports the truth of a matter by allowing others to infer it. So in the case of the robbery I mentioned before, a person seeing someone running away holding a woman's purse and then sees a woman shouting, "My purse has been stolen," can infer that the person running away with the purse is the robber. Indirect evidence about forced organ harvesting allows a person to infer that forced organ harvesting has occurred. And there are lots of forms of indirect evidence which we'll be going through today, such as statements by witnesses who've heard other people talk about forced organ harvesting and accounts of events that are consistent with, infer or suggest that forced organ harvesting is taking place, like blood testing and organ scans and ready availability of organs. And each piece of indirect evidence adds to the body of evidence from which we can infer that forced organ harvesting takes place. And people may say that indirect evidence is weak and not really proof of organ harvesting, but this can be countered by explaining that there are multiple forms of indirect evidence. They all support each other concerning the truth of the matter. The indirect evidence is consistent with the direct evidence, and that direct evidence is scarce for the reasons I've suggested. And as Andrew Koo mentioned in the quote on the screen, the value of the collective body of the evidence is greater than the sum of the parts. It all adds up to paint a very strong picture of the planned, systematic, institutional and intentional organ harvesting. And one final point about evidence is that it's common for complex criminal cases, such as this one, to rely on indirect evidence. It's not unusual at all. It's quite common for there to be indirect evidence rather than direct evidence of these type of crimes. Okay, one final bit of clarification is to do with relevant terms in understanding forced organ harvesting. So first of all, organ trafficking is a general term which refers to the removal of organs from living or dead people when there has been no free, voluntary, informed consent, and when the organs are being removed for financial or other benefit. So organ trafficking can occur from living people, like people can have a kidney removed against their will, or it can occur from deceased people, in which most or all of the organs can be used. Forced organ harvesting is killing the person without their consent for the purpose of transplanting their organs. So forced organ harvesting is a type of organ trafficking. Organ trafficking is the umbrella term, and forced organ harvesting is the more specific crime that we're talking about today. Prisoners' organs refers to the removal of organs from people who are imprisoned. And according to all international ethical guidelines on this, it is unethical to take organs from prisoners, even if they apparently give their consent, because if a person is incarcerated and faced with a death penalty, it's not a situation in which they can give free, voluntary, informed consent. So all jurisdictions with ethical guidelines on organ transplantation around the world prohibit the use of prisoners' organs. Another question that comes up is just to do with types of executed prisoners. We're mainly concerned with the Uyghurs here, and also other prisoners of conscience like the Falun Gongs, Tibetans and House Christians, who have been imprisoned for their belief or opinions, and they are not people who have been charged with specific crimes in general. Other prisoners who are executed are convicted or criminal prisoners who have been imprisoned and sentenced to death on the basis of being found guilty of a crime by the Chinese criminal justice system. Of course, that system is quite corrupt, and there's no guarantee that people who are found criminals in that case necessarily are, but we're particularly concerned with the prisoners of conscience, the people like the Uyghurs in the camps who've just been rounded up with no crime committed or accused even. Blood tests are necessary for organ transplantation because a person whose organs are going to be used has to be checked to be clear of infections, and also to see what blood type and tissue type they are for cross-matching. And cross-matching is a test to find out whether the organ from the victim or donor will match the person who wants to have the organ implanted into them. As well as blood tests, organ scanning is a part of the preparation for organ transplantation or removal of organs from the victim, because these tests can check the health of the organs in a living person, and they include ultrasounds, x-rays, CAT scans, ECGs of the heart. And finally, I just want to mention waiting lists, which are a list of people who need a transplant. And in countries like Australia, the UK, Europe, people who need a transplant are put on a list to wait until somebody dies who's available to be a donor to them. And the waiting lists in Australia and other countries are well over 3 years for a kidney, 3 to 7 years for a kidney, and probably 5 to 9 or 10 months for a liver. But in China, as we'll see, the waiting list is weeks rather than months or years, which implies a very ready supply of organs.